Phenomenology, Part 5, Playing on Purpose. A friend of mine suggests that this is best understood as a first world problem, as he puts it, that across role playing, he observes that difficulties arise due to murk, procedural problems, understanding what to do, how to do it, understanding how what we say relates to what happens, being comfortable with different combinations or even finding an agreeable combination of all the different possible variables of how it's done, and in effect, having a difficult and unsatisfying interaction with the medium itself. So that struggling actually to have things happen, period, and finding patch methods or rule sets which jump us in a way, struggly way through getting it done is as good as the person or people are used to doing. If one is in that frame of mind, then talking about playing on purpose is simply not accessible. It's very easy to take what I think of as purpose and confuse it with the things one is struggling with, so that it's a matter of a dedicated fictional outcome, or it's a matter of a particular procedural set of activities, and say, oh, well, that's what you're talking about. You're talking about not using dice, but whatever. And none of that has any relevance to this playing on purpose thing at all. So, therefore, he says, let's just set that aside. We have way, way more to do. There's so much more attention that needs to be paid simply toward working with the medium for what it is and attending to things like playing on purpose. Let it take care of itself as people find ways in which the medium makes more sense to them and is more enjoyable. Then that will take care of itself in due time, or at least might. Well, perhaps he's right. And I've also found, and I think it's fair to identify as one of the big difficulties, is that when you do observe a group which, in their enjoyment of the medium and the outcomes, the procedures that they use that generate outcomes, and have a sense of, I'm glad I did this, and we have done it, and you can watch how they enjoy it, and concern yourself with what among the people, what genuinely human social dynamics have been satisfied through the exercise of these activities. When you look at those, that group of people really isn't going to consider their purpose worthy of discussion. Why? How could it be? They did it, and this is why they came here, and what else would you do? This was great. Why are we talking about this? So either you can't talk about it, or you aren't talking about it. So it's a very interesting process to watch people go through. All the people that I have observed proceed from one of these states to the other, that period during which talking about purposes of play was relevant to them was very brief. And it makes it almost impossible to discuss it in a presentation of this kind. I don't know who I'm talking to. And I don't know where you're at with your play. I don't know what kind of satisfactions you have. And to talk about the diversity of different purposes could either be fascinating or baffling and wrongheaded as far as you're concerned. Proceeding anyway, let's think a little bit about how people engage with one another in social leisure activities. One of the most recognizable and familiar has to do with putting oneself in positions of challenge relative to the efforts of others. The subset of that is competition, but really the larger sense of this is kind of hard to do, and it's kind of, you have to bring a little skill, a little investment, a little bit of oomph to this, and a recognition of lost conditions. Now, how terrible are these losses? Most of the time, they're not terrible at all. It only exists in the context of this activity, and, if this particular game was lost or this particular round was lost, whatever. Of course, you can take it to different levels in which what is lost becomes far more emotionally or even financially or professionally consequential. But that's, of course, not necessary. Well, anyway, if we think of this as a fun thing to do, and we think of this as people doing it in a fun way, something that they like and return to because they like doing this with each other, then you can see the same kind of thing occur with the role playing medium. Now, this is pretty interesting because you're talking about a fictional medium, and the fiction has outcomes of its own. But I'm not talking about those outcomes as such. I'm talking about the regard and the recognition among us of those lost conditions and how they may be subjected, for example, to that bounciness, but they are also subjected or contingent upon your effort and your use of the available procedures. This kind of interaction applied to the development of the fiction that I'm talking about is remarkably fun. I don't even have to say that if this is something that you yourself have experienced. In fact, if you yourself have experienced, you're kind of blinking and saying, why are we talking about this? Of course. Or on the other hand, if this is something you haven't experienced, whether it's a matter of playing on purpose at all or a matter that you happen not to enjoy this type of activity very much, you may have an extremely aversive response to it. It may appear to you to be intrusive and disruptive of the developing fiction, for example. That's what any of these purposes that I'm talking about are like. They're a blast to do, unless you can't get the medium together to do anything except to just force the medium to get one more step along. They're also not fun to do if it's not what you want to do. What other possibilities are there? One, I think, should be immediately suggested by the fact that we're creating fiction in the first place. I already spoke about how historically creating fiction and creating stories with the fiction are intimately tied together. It should seem not particularly difficult to say that if we are indeed generating fiction with time and consequence in it, that the human urge to really focus on those trenchant story components that we see in most stories could be invoked, could become the playing on purpose for that group. And that's true. It can be. It doesn't have to be. You can end up with plot as the side effect of the other things you were doing towards some other purpose. That's fine too. Here we're talking about attention to this in its most satisfying sense as authors and as audience. Now, with that in mind, if that's happening, here's the one thing that the procedures of play can't include. They can't include the guarantee of doing any such thing. If they do, if the procedures of play lock down, okay, and this is how the story goes, and we snap into place different ways it might go, but it's all set up to be done in a kind of push button way, then this purpose can't be met. It can't be satisfied. Similarly, if there are empowerments among the group of people which permit ignoring, overriding, or sweeping aside the outcomes of what we do so that a story can be imposed, whether prepped beforehand, improvised on the spot, whatever, but the idea being that control over, okay, I'm going to make sure that the story occurs as an interpolated or interposed thing stuck in there, then no, the enjoyment of doing this is gone. So therefore, we have some really interesting difficulties in talking about the production of story. If you have a situation in which people do utilize the outcomes of play such that plot is, for lack of a better word, what happens, and the attention to the emotional engagements of story, catharsis perhaps, are involved, you typically are going to have a situation where the people actually don't call themselves story creators. People are used to, everybody is used to thinking of story as being made over here and enjoyed over there. Well, they didn't do that, so how could they be story creators? They say, well, we don't try to make a story. It was organic. You know, I guess story happened, and yeah, they won't talk about anything else in terms of how much they enjoy. This is where their heads are at. But the notion that they sat down and composed a story is exactly what they don't want to say. To them, that would have been forcing a composed story into play, the last thing on earth that they wanted to do. So in many ways, the most story producing people in role playing are the people who typically are aversive to using words like authorship and story creation. Similarly, if you have play in which the more traditional notion of authorship is in place, where one person is empowered to be story maker, whether to have prepped it beforehand and to be pretty comfortable with the notion that during play they nudge things or force things or otherwise control things such that it occurs. If you have anything like that going on, then interestingly enough, the people who are playing that way will trumpet their commitment to the story. After all, they're ignoring the other outcomes so that that happens, right? How could you need any other proof that you are into the story? Well, perhaps you're into it as audience, perhaps you're into it as separated author, but you are not actually creating the story through the procedures of play at all. Trying, therefore, to discuss playing on purpose with stories as where you're at runs afoul of this murky, difficult terminology and very strong, almost triggered reactions about whether you are or aren't into story during play. So, therefore, I leave it at the statement, here be dragons. Let's get at this in a little more procedural detail. What do I mean by this kind of enjoyment? The first component of it concerns the procedures that we actually use. Are people genuinely picking up the instrumentation of play and interposing what they're doing with it with the developing fiction as it continues along in a way that they find easy, in a way that they find doable, in a way that they actually find enhances the vividness of those interactions and of the fiction as it proceeds. When that's occurring, the tendency then is to see how people feel as they do it, as evidenced in a couple of ways. Just how they speak when they contribute to the fiction, when they're describing something imagined, and also in the way that they acknowledge one another, listen to one another, and return that listening. There is a warmth to that process which is absolutely unmistakable. The first one is quite interesting because a person may enter a state in which they are almost in a hypnagogic aspect or condition of creativity. The general reported sense is a sense of deep identification, a delivery of what, for example, one's character may do with no reflection whatsoever, and yet to the observer seems incredibly coherent and incredibly consistent with that character, even if the character is making a radical decision. This state is not to be forced. It occurs when, again, the procedures of play, no matter how mechanical or how quantitative, are interacting with the developing fiction and as an attentive phenomenon among us that generates this sense of creative muse-like phenomenon. Well, there's that, and then there are also the interactions that are far less hypnagogic and far more interactive, where there may simply be a look, there may simply be a grunt, rarely a verbal acknowledgement or secondary description of what's going on. Often an auxiliary contribution. Somebody may do something say something about what their character is, either in or out of that state I was talking about, as long as it seems to be this enjoying themselves while they do it. And then somebody else adds a secondary description, maybe even in terms of how the character feels, or a judgmental statement, or something like that. I mentioned sound effects at one point. Interestingly enough, they count very well toward these ends. This kind of secondary or auxiliary contribution of what's happening, reinforcement as it's being said, not just uptake and then saying, well, then my character does this, which shows that you were listening, but also, as I say, a supportive one of what that person is doing at that moment. When play is characterized by these things, and when discussions that are not in character at all and are not directly descriptive at all, but may even be about entirely real world things right here in the moment, but yet still contribute to the next contribution. When all of this is happening, it's real easy to see why and what for people are playing. What do I really mean about this playing on purpose? If we focus on that larger set of real people doing a real activity among one another, and what kind of demonstrable satisfaction is there. I'm glad I did this. I'm glad I did this with you. What is it? What interactions do we see? One might say, well, the medium is the message and constructing the medium is enough. My observation is when I encounter that response, one, we may be looking at people who have struggled with making the medium occur at all so much that they just simply can't conceive of doing anything else except make it happen, and are often still enmeshed in that struggle. Second, people who are conducting the very things I was just talking about, one or the other, typically of that challenge and loss based kind of tense but really, really fun, you know, exciting thing. Or we can talk about that other kind of excitement where the commitment to the developing and tension increasing degrees of fiction, such that what we end up with really has that we're creating a story, we're enjoying a story intensity. Bear in mind, none of this has anything to do with intrinsic instrumentation, that you say, well, these people use a lot of dice, so they must be into this whole challenge and loss thing, and these people, they don't use any dice, so they must be into this more story thing. All of that is wrongheaded. All of that is stuck in the procedures and trying to make the fiction go state of mind. Yes, the procedures employed have everything to do with the enjoyment of these purposes when they're in place. How that happens is nothing as simple-minded as this instrument makes that happen. Well, let's take a look then at what we see. What we see are people interacting with one another about what they're doing, and all you have to do is use ordinary observation of human behavior, nothing technical, nothing complicated, and say, how are they enjoying themselves? Do we have enjoyment of the medium for its own sake as one of these purposes? Sure. Do we have potentially other purposes besides the two that I addressed in some detail? Sure. Let's talk about what those may be when we actually look at people and ourselves really playing in order to divine what they may be.